Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this press briefing from Geneva. My name is Tony Consul. I'm the head of communications here at IATA. I'm joined by Brian Pearce, our chief economist, by Sebastian Miklos, who's our senior vice president for member and external relations, and Alexandre Juniac, our director general and chief executive officer. We will begin the press briefing with a short presentation from Brian Pearce, looking primarily at July traffic results. Then Alexandre will make some opening remarks, and after that we'll throw it open to questions. Please can I ask you to provide questions through the chat function, and we will try and answer them in the order that they're received. So with that, I'll throw it over to Brian Pearce to get us started.
Thank you very much, and good day to everybody. We've now got data on air travel through July, and this is a particularly important month because it's the first of the two peak months for air travel in the industry, and of course coinciding with the northern summer. And as you can see from this chart, which shows global passenger kilometres flown, we did see the normal rise in air travel during those summer months. But if we adjust for that normal seasonal increase, the red line, you can see that the trend is still very weak. We're up from the April low in July, but not by very much. In year-on-year terms, July saw travel at more or less 80% down on a year ago, and that compares to the low point in April when we were 94% down. This is disappointing. It's actually a little less than we had expected in our forecasts, so clearly there's some downside risk to the forecasts that we were talking about earlier, but we'll have to see how the next couple of months develops. The reason for the weakness, the relatively slow rise through July, is essentially a lack of international travel. And you can see here that international passenger kilometres flown were roughly 92% down on a year earlier in July. That's really not very much of an improvement from the low point. However, what we have seen is quite an encouraging rise in domestic air travel, which was down just under 58% in July. So I think this does show that there's a willingness to fly. What I guess we should also point out, though, is that even within those domestic markets, there's quite a lot of variation. And what we've seen in the last few months is that the Chinese domestic market has improved very encouragingly. July was something like 28% down on a year earlier. The Chinese domestic market is growing very significantly. Other markets, though, aren't. We've seen some growth in the US market, the US domestic market, but the Australian market is still 90% down on where it was a year ago. And these differences are largely explained by the relative success in controlling the coronavirus. And in the US and Australian markets in particular, we're seeing new cases significantly higher than where they were just a little while ago, in contrast to China. The other difference is in airlines are pricing to stimulate demand very significantly in the Chinese market, where the average fare was down 33% in July, and that is helping to stimulate the growth that we've seen. Less so in other markets. But it's not just price stimulation. Typically, coming out of a downturn, and obviously this is an exceptional downturn, but typically airlines would bring about recovery in travel markets through price stimulation. We're seeing, as I say, we are seeing a bit of that, but This time it is different. Confidence is important, and clearly the health issues are a major factor here. And I think this is illustrated particularly well in the case of Vietnam's domestic market. And we're looking here at flights rather than RPKs, just because that gives us more timely data. We can see what's happened through August. And as you can see, that domestic market had fully recovered by July. Unfortunately, we've seen a reappearance of COVID new cases in the last few weeks, and we've seen that market push back downwards. Moving to the international markets, where I think this is where we see the biggest challenge, both in terms of consumers' ability to travel, but also for the industry. And if we look at some of the major route areas internationally through to July, as you can see, markets like the North Atlantic, the Pacific market within Asia, they're all showing absolutely no growth. The one market where we have seen some growth is the within European market, reflecting the travel bubble, the travel corridors that have been opened up in the Schengen area and with a few other partner countries. But typically, the main issue we face is that for most countries, borders are closed to international travel. I think it's interesting to look at how consumers and businesses are feeling, because these are key drivers. In the absence of travel restrictions, these are the factors that will drive air travel. And we've got a very encouraging picture on business confidence. The blue line here shows the measure of global business confidence. And following the unlocking of economies, businesses are actually feeling in a pretty positive mood in terms of increasing output, and that should be reflected in stronger GDP growth, which is typically a key driver for the industry. The challenge, though, is that particularly for leisure travel, consumers are not feeling the same confidence as businesses, and perhaps with the rise in unemployment rate and the expected rise in unemployment, that's not a surprise. And what we're actually seeing here is that air travel, you can see the global revenue passenger kilometres in the black line here, are really reflecting what we've seen happen to consumer confidence rather than the improvements in business confidence. And certainly we've discussed a lot in the past that our discussions with corporate travel buyers and the evidence that we've seen suggests that corporates are not travelling at the moment. We are seeing some rebound in holiday travel and visiting friends and relatives. Interestingly, though, when we dig beneath those revenue passenger kilometre numbers, the number of premium seats are growing, or the number of premium tickets are actually growing at a similar pace to the growth of economy tickets. So I think there might be some evidence that we are seeing some business travel, albeit at relatively low levels. So confidence is an issue, particularly the weakness of consumer confidence. And one of the key challenges is to help recover the confidence of passengers and travellers. I must say that policy is not helping. A lot of borders, even if they're not closed, quarantines are proving to be a major barrier to air travel. And just to illustrate that, this is the UK case. The green bars there show where the Schengen countries announced opening of borders, and then the UK relaxed its own quarantine restrictions in June, leading to significant increase in both bookings, and that's what this line shows, and travel. But you can see what happened once quarantine was reimposed. We saw a very dramatic fall in air travel. And this inconsistency of policy as well is also adding to the uncertainty which is restricting air travel. This sort of business environment, it makes it very difficult for airlines to schedule and to plan ahead. And I think the consequence of that we're seeing here in this chart, which shows load factors, passenger load factors by region. Because what we're seeing is that airlines are bringing back schedules and services, but because demand is growing so slowly, and because consumers are actually booking much later, so there's very little forward visibility, we're ending up in a situation where there's actually too much capacity, and so load factors in July, as you can see, were at record lows in almost all markets. There is an exception, and that's the domestic Chinese market, where actually we're seeing some quite encouraging developments associated, obviously, with the very low levels of COVID cases there. But there's a domestic Chinese market, there's a return to travel, and fairly good load factors. That is not the case, unfortunately, in other markets. And the border closures are obviously one of the key issues here. And this problem of the difficulty of planning schedules and capacity, it looks like that's continuing at least over the next couple of months. We had a look at the bookings data to see what that's suggesting for August travel. And as you can see, some further improvement. In fact, it should be a little bit better than that, because we know that consumers are booking much, much later. So that's not a full picture. But then if we look at the service, the capacity that's been provided based on the flights that we know have taken place, and then in September based on the schedules that airlines have announced, that gap is widening. And that gap, unfortunately, means airlines are probably burning cash as a result of essentially the disappointingly slow improvement in demand. And that does mean that leaves airline finances in a relatively fragile situation, as we know governments are starting to pull back on the support they've given through measures like wage subsidies. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. I now ask Alexandre to provide a few quick remarks to give some context to that, and then we'll throw it open for questions.
Thank you very much. I was hoping that today we could report a strong northern summer season and with a clear vision to a recovery for aviation. Unfortunately, as Brian has presented, that's far from the industry's reality today. Borders are largely closed, and government management of travel restrictions is so unpredictable and uncoordinated that people are still not flying. For the industry, this is immensely frustrating. It is also frustrating for travelers who cannot see family and loved ones, do business, or take a break. And it is tragic for the growing numbers of unemployed whose livelihoods are being destroyed. There has been no lack of effort to reassure governments that flying is safe. Through the leadership of the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, and with the support of the World Health Organization, global protocols for safely restarting aviation were agreed by governments in June. Many countries have implemented the guidelines, which is good. But this produces little results because there is no coordination to manage the reopening of borders. Quarantine measures, in particular, are keeping aviation, travel and tourism effectively in lockdown. We understand and completely agree that the top priority for everybody in this crisis is the health and safety for citizens. But we believe that there are alternative measures that will keep people safe and enable global connectivity. That's why today we are proposing a 3-point plan to safely reopen borders. First, implement the ICAO takeoff guidelines universally. Second, build on the solid work of ICAO Council's Aviation Recovery Task Force, the CART, by developing an agreed common framework for states to use in coordinating the safe reopening of their borders to aviation. 3, develop COVID-19 testing measures that will enable the reopening of borders by reducing the risk of COVID-19 importation to what is acceptable to public health authorities with accuracy, speed, and scalability that also meet the exacting requirements for incorporation into the travel process. As a participant in the ICAO CART, IATA will work with governments, medical experts, and testing manufacturers to accelerate proposals specifically focused on using COVID-19 testing to rebuild confidence, reopen borders, restart aviation, recharge demand, and restore jobs. There is much at stake and no time to lose. The good news is that the speed, accuracy, and scalability of testing is rapidly improving, and we need to plan now so that we are ready to quickly take advantage of testing when it can be applied to facilitate travel. I will emphasize the need for leadership. The challenges of a global pandemic will not be solved by governments acting in isolation. The protocols are established for safe flight. Now, governments must take the next step with coordinated global leadership to manage the risks of opening borders. With testing, technology, science, and determination, borders can be reopened and the world can start moving again. The disappointing summer also provides 2 other important reminders for governments. Number 1, the first, is that financial relief measures are still needed. The crisis is lasting longer than most would have predicted. The initial round of measures will need to be topped up. The industry needs a financial lifeline that will keep them afloat. And importantly, this must be done in ways that do not further increase the debt burden. The second is the urgent need for a waiver of the 80-20 use it or lose it slot rule. Many governments such as Australia, New Zealand, China, Singapore, Brazil, and Mexico have granted a waiver for the full winter season. But Europe is underestimating the challenge and dragging its feet. Somehow, they believe that demand could rebound to 75% or even 85% of last year's levels by early 2021. That is much more optimistic than any industry forecast or the evolution of traffic seen over the peak summer season. And their intention to provide a response only in mid-October gives precious little time for airlines and airports to plan. Airlines and airports are aligned in their call for all governments to act, and this is particularly critical for the EC as many countries look to EC decisions for leadership on this issue. Addressing this should be at the top of Europe's aviation agenda. We now look forward to your question. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you very much, Alexandre. We have a number of questions already in the queue, so we'll get started. The first question talks about consumer confidence, and particularly travel bans, quarantines, etc. And the question is if we could speak a little bit more to what exactly the impact of those is on travel. So maybe, Brian, that's a bit of a
Sure.
expansion on which you've already spoken about a bit.
Yeah. I think what we have seen is a rebound in the pent up demand for seeing family and perhaps catching those summer holidays. But for a sustained rise in leisure travel, we really need to see a significant rise of consumer confidence. Now, the figures I showed were essentially about consumers' confidence in their financial circumstances, and that's very low at the moment, reflecting the rise of unemployment, the rise in job uncertainty. But in addition to that, there's clearly a need for consumers to feel confident about the travel experience. And so many of the measures that Alexandre has just spoken about are related to bolstering the confidence of consumers in that flying is safe.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brian. We have a question, I think, for Alexandre. The questioner says they understand, okay, our position is that borders should reopen, but what specific measures do we want to see in place in order for those borders to reopen safely?
We see among the travel restrictions that have been put in place by government, you have the global closure of borders. That's an absolute stop to any travel for obvious reason. But there are also mainly the quarantine measures that have been put in place, frankly, in a partially or completely disorderly way in many parts of the world, and that are also a stop to air travel. So what we ask governments is to adopt more consistent approach, a risk-based approach, which would aim at reopening borders by effectively reopening borders by lifting travel restriction and especially quarantine measures. And as we fully understand, the need for protecting the population against virus import or virus transmission, to implement a consistent, safe, solid process to prevent this virus transmission to happen between countries. And we are advocating in favor of testing, which appears to be, as I said, ready for being used in air travel and giving confidence both to travelers and to governments to reopen borders and lift up quarantine measures.
Okay, thank you. We have a question on slots. We've said that our slot proposal is supported by the industry, airlines and airports, and yet Wizz Air is calling for something quite opposite. I know, Sebastian, you've done some research on Wizz Air. Can you maybe explain our position on that?
So our position is IATA that provided the figures that were presented by Brian, but also the general trend we see. The slot waiver for winter, this famous slot waiver of the 80-20 rule, should be extended at the same level, the same length, and with the same principles as the summer one. And this is what we have been advocating for many weeks now. As Alexandre mentioned, many countries already granted this waiver, basically following the same conditions that in summer. Of course, we believe that this is helping mainly the passengers, because then airlines can be more risk-driven on planning the networks, and they can make more offering and be more flexible on the network planning for the winter season. We avoid these famous ghost flights where airlines are operating flights they should not operate just because they want to keep the slots. That's the waiver. Of course, I'm surprised by Wizz Air position on that, and we are surprised and a little sorry about that, because of course we advocate in front of for the whole industry, but Wizz Air is not a member of ours, so we are even more surprised, because Wizz Air has benefited from our advocacy. And has used the waiver in few of its slots, and will be using this waiver when the waiver is granted, which we hope will happen, especially by the Commission in I hope what I would call in the next days. So we don't understand it, as it's been the only airline until now that has opposed it. So we are surprised. We would just like to convince them to change their mind, but this is maybe a reason to invite Wizz Air to join IATA as quickly as possible. But all the other airlines and even non-IATA members have expressed support or just support the position of a general waiver.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian. Maybe this question for Alexandre and Brian. In asking for financial assistance that doesn't increase the debt burden, are we therefore specifically asking for grants rather than loans, or are there other measures we have in mind?
I mean, there are some other measures. I think that there's a difference in the situation that we're in now, as airlines are starting to bring their fleet back into service and provide air services, because they're clearly taking on a lot of additional cost in operating those services at a time when revenues are very weak. So what's needed is actually support for the operations, and we indeed saw the Chinese government give support, some subsidies for international operations early on. We've actually seen the Hong Kong government injecting cash into working capital by forward purchases of tickets. So there are some interesting ways and helpful ways government can provide support without increasing the debt burden, which ultimately could sink airlines.
Sebastian, you have something to add?
I just wanted to emphasize what Brian said, because there are basically three groups of subsidies that we observed on the market, and I wouldn't call it subsidies actually. There are cash injections that are done to airlines. There are deferral of costs, so it increases the debt of the airline, but these are costs that the airlines can preserve, typically on parking fees or any contribution that our infrastructure can provide us. But there is a third element which I would like to recognize, or there are two elements actually. One is that airlines are now renegotiating their leasing costs, and there is a lot of private companies who support the airlines by deferring or waiving or renegotiating the cost of leasing, which in this situation is particularly appreciated because, as you know, leasing is a fixed cost to the lessors, and it would be a great support to have this. But also there are employees who are waiving and decreasing part of their salaries, and this is also a support that comes directly from our community to the airlines to support the sustainability of the airline in this difficult period. So there is an absolute multitude of ways in which an airline can be helped directly or indirectly, and as IATA we are very strongly supporting, but also very strongly cognizant of this fact, and thankful that this support is put in place.
Okay, thanks, Sebastian. We have a question about the measures that are being implemented. As we saw, there was a TUI flight from Greece to Cardiff in which passengers were not wearing masks, and there seems to be some issues of potential importation of COVID as a result of that. How damaging are such reports and behavior to the industry's chances of recovery?
This type of behavior is pretty damaging for the industry, but also it shows that we must, when we agree on process, on measures, we must implement them as we do for all the safety measures we are using daily in our flights. So we should not have any compromise in the health, security, and checking measures. We have negotiated and adopted within the ICAO organization. No compromise in implementing them strictly.
Okay, thank you. We have a question, I think, for Brian. So we've looked at what's happened over the summer period. Looking forward, what are the expectations for fall and winter? And in particular, what would the potential impact of a second wave have on those expectations?
Yes. We're seeing some encouraging developments in the broader economy. If we look at business confidence, if we look at measures of output of GDP, we are seeing some encouraging signs. The challenge that we face is with and that's reflected, I think, in the domestic air travel, where we have seen some encouraging strength, for example, in the Chinese market. We would expect that domestic strength to continue. The challenge is really on international travel, which represents 2/3 of the global RPKs the industry would typically fly. So that's critical. And at the moment, with borders closed, we're seeing very little recovery. So I think it does depend critically on, first of all, on the path of the COVID virus, and that has clearly deteriorated. Path has not been as encouraging as it looked a few weeks ago. But there are ways forward through the protocols that Alexandre has outlined, and we do think that if those are successfully and consistently implemented by governments, then we could see a resumption of international travel, which then might not damage the forecasts that clearly are under some risk at the moment, given recent developments.
Okay. We have another question on relief measures. The questioner asks, are there any particular regions that need relief more than others at this point in time?
Well, yes. I mean, we've seen a very uneven approach from governments. Yeah. Whereas the US and North America has been very well supported, Europe has been supported to some degree. The big emerging market areas, particularly Africa, but also Latin America. We've seen very little support, and the bankruptcies that we have seen, particularly in Latin America, are really as a direct result of that lack of support.
Okay. The same questioner has a question not about a COVID topic, but something perhaps we could comment on, which is the reestablishment of links between the UAE and Israel and the historic flight that took place yesterday. Do we see that as a positive development?
We always see a new route, new flights as a positive development. That's for sure. But it's not only an industry point of view. I think it's a more generally political approach, or even ethic approach.
Okay. We have a question about premium travel. So, Brian, you commented earlier on the equal development of premium travel with economy. The questioner asks, have we noticed any other types of market changes? For example, a shift towards private aviation, or have we seen any shifts in the demographics of the way people are traveling, perhaps fewer older people, more younger people, etc.?
Yes, I mean, it's obviously early days to...
Thank you. We have a couple of questions as follow-up to the question on the TUI flight, specifically with respect to mask wearing. Is there sufficient clout behind industry efforts to be able to enforce mask wearing, or do we need other structures to enable greater or better enforcement or more consistent enforcement?
I have flown myself recently 2 or 3 times. Frankly, everybody was wearing a mask, and nobody has tried anything, to avoid wearing a mask or asking for exception or whatever. So I think it is accepted. In our industry, we are used to have people respect some rules strictly and abide by the rules, especially when we talk about safety. So we think that normally we should be able to implement these measures using our people, our personnel, and in case we could perhaps have special procedures or the help of dedicated staff, either the police or if there is a problem. But I think it's more an exception than general rule.
And to add to what Alexandre is saying, our position as IATA is very clear. When a passenger buys a ticket, he or she agrees to obey to the rules that the airline is introducing. That's part of the contract of travel. So from that perspective, if a crew asks to wear a mask, which, as Alexandre said, is very broadly followed, if somebody disobeys, for us it falls clearly under unruly passengers regulation. This is why we are advocating also to have the recognition of Montreal Convention worldwide, because we would like to provide a very safe environment for crew to work and to have very clear tools even to disembark the passengers, and those cases were known, who is not obeying the sanitary regulations imposed by the airline, which are imposed on us by sanitary authorities. So for us, if a crew asks you to wear a mask, that's the same like you don't smoke on board of a plane now, because that's a long-lasting agreement. And if you smoke, it's considered as unruly behavior. If the sanitary procedures are that you wear a mask, you simply wear a mask, and that's our airline responsibility to enforce it, because we have a broader safety responsibility. So it's a very unequivocal question.
Right, thank you. Another question on testing. Are there any airports, airlines, or countries that have testing measures in place that we think could be an example or the start of the solution?
That's a good point. There are, as you know, there are several airports and countries that are implementing testing procedures, but they are very different one from another, using different type of tests. And first of all, secondly, the diagnosis industry is also with which we have strong, very regular contact and information. They also say that for the moment everything is not fully ready. So they recommend to be very rigorous, very cautious, and we cannot say that anywhere in the world there is an airport or a country that, from a testing point of view, is a perfect example of what we are looking for.
This is why we have CART. The CART is bringing together airports, which is a fundamental part of an experience journey, airlines, which is us, health authorities, which covers as an umbrella and gives us indications of testing, which tests, etc., and all of this with the guidance of ICAO, which are states. So this is why these four stakeholders needs to go through CART just to agree on what is the acceptable, implementable solution worldwide, so we avoid this closure and an open source market. This is why CART is so fundamental for us.
Great, thank you. Just to be clear, CART is an ICAO process.
Sorry, CART is an ICAO process.
Which is also supported by the World Health Organization.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Brian, we have a few questions on regional performance. So maybe I'll bunch them together and we'll take them in order. So the first is Argentina. And I suppose part of it is how do we see the market performing, and the other part is when do we see it opening up?
I mean, Latin America is facing substantial challenges from the difficulties in controlling the virus spread, and Argentina in particular also has been suffering from significant economic challenges. I think that we would hope to see markets open up because, particularly for Argentina, the economic benefits from the trade and tourism brought by air transport is actually going to be quite an important factor behind their economic recovery. So, we're certainly working very closely with governments to put in place market openings, and we're seeing some encouraging discussions about travel bubbles in the region that could perhaps facilitate that.
Okay. Next market is India. So we've seen since the market reopened, 100,000 passengers a day are now flying domestically. How do we view that as a development? Is that significant? Is that still a long way to go? And when do we anticipate a bounce back for India?
Yeah, it is significant. Certainly not as significant as the recovery that we've seen in China. But I think that a lot of the divergences that we're seeing in domestic markets are associated with the success or otherwise in controlling the virus. I think that is going to be the determining factor behind a full recovery in domestic markets. But I think that in India, I think in many of the domestic economies, once the virus has been brought under control, we're seeing, and the economies are unlocked, people return to work, we're seeing a very sharp rise in business confidence and actually quite a good bounce back in economic activity. So that's quite positive for domestic travel. I'm fairly confident that we're going to see a reasonable recovery in domestic travel. I think the challenge is going to be internationally with the opening of borders.
Okay, great, thank you. And the last region is Africa. How do we see the recovery there? In particular, the questioner is asking about Middle East to Africa routes and traffic.
Right, okay. I'm going to hand over in a second to my colleague Sebastian to talk about that. But again, I think Africa has, Africa was sort of later on in the COVID trajectory as Latin America was. We've started to see some encouraging signs and some growth, some opening up of domestic markets and some international borders opening. But I think the airlines in that region are really challenged by the fact that there's been very limited government support. And, of course, commodity prices have collapsed, so that has further damaged the economies. I think it's a really challenging region for both the traveller and for the airlines. But Sebastian, you've more experience of operating on the ground.
Yes, indeed. Africa, generally as a continent, has a big challenge in connectivity. So first thing I would like to note is that we see a recovery of traffic from Middle East to Africa. There are airlines who are successfully opening countries. But it's worth recognizing that African state has made significant efforts to be flexible, to adapt to the ICAO recommendations. Among the first countries who fully adopted the card recommendations, so the first card, so this ICAO process was Rwanda. We saw Kenya opening widely the possibility of traveling. We see Ghana, who made a lot of effort. So there is lots of sub-Saharan countries which has adopted very quickly very courageous and flexible measures to be able to travel. Now, as Brian is saying, we have a situation in which the GDPs of those countries has probably tremendously suffered already from the lockdown. No export of any perishable goods and no tourism, which probably redirects the interest of the states from airlines to support other industries. So our worry in IATA is that as many airlines are supported in Africa as possible, because what we need to focus and advocate for is the inter-African connectivity, which is delivered by few carriers, but we really need to have a close eye on Africa as a continent, because I also include in that our friends from Morocco, Tunisia, is that we really try to create intra-African connectivity and have airlines surviving, and we will advocate to have any financial relief for them, so they are allowed to go beyond the COVID and still provide what is the essence of their existence, which is connectivity.
Okay, thank you. We have a question on costs. All these new measures, health-related measures, will probably have costs associated with them. Are we concerned that they could become permanent costs? And do we see the potential for example, governments having a health charge on airlines or airports charging airlines for certain health costs? or perhaps airlines charging passengers for the cost of certain health measures?
Of course, there is a concern about costs because someone will have to pay for that. Under the international health regulation, which is the document, the official document that is applicable and implemented through WHO, normally when there are such type of costs related to health, they should be supported by governments. So we will ask governments, for instance, to support the testing, the cost of testing, and so that will be our policy. But I'm sure that we will have several ideas, to share the cost between the various, actors in these processes.
So for the moment, the bulk of the cost would be whatever the sanitary authorities recommend us at the airport, because the customer experience on board of the plane has not changed significantly. It has changed pre-boarding. But it's very difficult to evaluate the impact of direct costs linked to COVID, because we don't really know when the reopening is massive what type of behaviors will be expected, other than what we already can expect, which is testing. But we really have to appreciate it when we're going to knowing how the passengers, what's going to be the routing inside the airport, and what are the investments the airport needs.
Thank you. We have a question on protocols for safe travel. We've talked a lot about the airline experience, but when people travel, they also use hotels, restaurants, other facilities. Do we see the rest of the industry moving as quickly, or do we see a need for more efforts across the travel chain?
There is a serious work and that has been done through the WTTC to try to organize the tourism industry, including travel, hotels, and various actors of this industry, to move in a coordinated way and to implement a consistent and similar processes. But the size of this industry, the variety of actors, the fact that you have completely different size of companies, of people working in this industry, leads to a more heterogeneous structure and behaviors. But we have to say that if the tourism industry and the travel industry wanted to recover, the more coordinated, the more consistent their approach is, the better it will be for everybody, and particularly to restore confidence of travelers and of governments.
Thank you. The question about the availability of testing in certain parts of the world, particularly in the developing world, are we confident that if we had some sort of testing regime, that it could be available in all parts of the world in the quantities that we would require?
We would advocate in favor of that. We would, of course, in our discussion under IATA with permission of WHO, we would advocate to have a fair repartition of this test, and a clever one, and an efficient and effective one, because we know perfectly that it is one of the issues. I mentioned that, if you remember, among the criteria of this testing process. We have to say that WHO is particularly skilled and used to these type of approaches. It's not new, unfortunately, for us and for an organization such as WHO. So yes, we will advocate in favor of that. We have identified this issue as one of the difficulties, but we think that we know how to overcome that.
Okay, thank you. We have a question, Brian. You had mentioned that the load factors are rather low. The questioner asks whether or not that's a good thing. In other words, the question specifically is, should aircraft be restricted to, say, 2/3 capacity in order to leave seats open, etc.? Alexandre, I know we've made our position clear on that. Do would you like to reiterate it?
There is no change in our position. We have always said that we thought that, and Brian provided with a lot of figures and analysis, that neutralizing seats was economically almost unbearable for airlines, and that if we implement safe processes such as wearing masks, health control, temperature control, etc., what has been recommended through CART, it was not adding an additional significant risk on virus transmission. In addition, we have a lot of studies about the way the air flows in the aircraft, about the way passengers are protected or isolated from being contaminated in an aircraft, and how the risk is minimized. So we reiterate that reducing the potential capacity of aircraft is not the right solution.
I mean, let me just add, we estimate that break-even passenger load factors this year and next year is probably in the region of 75%. So by eliminating seats in between passengers across the fleet, that would mean maximum load factor of 62%. So the industry would be clearly losing lots of money under those circumstances. Obviously, this is there's a health issue here, but as Alexandre has said, we believe that the travel experience is safe with the use of masks and the protocols. The alternative to airlines continuing to burn significant amounts of cash is that air travel has to get much more expensive.
And it's important to remind that airlines have already introduced a lot of protocols, because there is a social distancing applied at many airports. There is the mandatory mask, but there is an additional cleaning of toilets. There is a very limited onboard service, which limits the possibility of not wearing the mask. There is a boarding by zones, which is done literally everywhere now, so you avoid to have congestion. And with all of that, we think that we know that the sanitary expectations are respected and airlines are implementing it. So adding on the burdens that we have a free seat, which scientifically is not proven that it will decrease the risk of getting the virus, it's not a position that we are advocating.
Yeah, basically the airlines are complying with the CART guidelines, absolutely, which don't include that. Absolutely. Yeah. Two last questions, because we're sort of at the top of the hour now. First question is specifically, I guess, for Sebastian. The questioner is asking about the situation in Poland. And they're saying with 44 countries on the ban list in Poland since earlier this week, we've seen some transfer to charter flights and other sort of opportunities for passengers to still get into Poland. The question is, does the ban make sense scientifically? And I suppose, how much harm will it do to the airline industry?
I mean, my answer is not as a Polish citizen, but as VP of IATA, and I'll deflect on what Alexandre was saying. I mean, the problem is not if a country, Poland or any other, is closing or opening borders. The problem is inconsistency of what we see also within Europe in the possibility of traveling alternatively to the airlines. And it's not only Polish question, but generally. The first is that we see a lot of inconsistency, and we are very surprised by that, to be extremely diplomatic. And the second thing is, of course, the random way of doing this. So basically, airlines are planning forward with many months of advance flights, and then they have to cancel everything within periods of days, because between the announcement and the ban, you have rarely more than 3-4 days. So I would like to focus on the fact that what we are appealing as IATA is really, we are advocating very strongly, is to have rules which will allow to predict the travel, not for airlines, but for passengers, because what we need is demand. That would be my answer.
Okay, thank you. And then we do have a few more questions in the queue, but I think we'll try and answer them one-on-one if we are able to identify the questioner. But the last question, and there were a few people who were asking it, is with respect to the IATA AGM. Is that still meant to be held in person in Amsterdam in November?
That's a very good question. We have this question on our table, and as soon as we'll have made a decision, considering the constraints, the evolution of the pandemic, what would be the attitude of the Dutch authorities and Dutch government, the restrictions that could be still in place, we'll make the decision, pretty in a very near future.
Great. Thank you very much. We have, as I said, just a few questions left in the queue. We'll try and deal with those individually. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us.